here we are at the only other SpongeBob season I talked about during my early days of reviewing. Season 10. And, what did I say about the season again?
Gonna be honest, have some sort of gripe with this season, so forewarning, I might get a bit snippy.
Yeah, that. I am pretty conflicted on how I feel about Season 10. With this being the shortest season of the entire show, the quality of the episodes during that season is a bit rocky. I'm not saying it's a bad season, but it is pretty standard for the most part. And it was kind of a bit tricky deciding what my least favorites and my favorites of the season were. The top picks were obvious, but the entries before that I kind of went back and forth on. But I eventually came to a conclusion on what my top 5 favorites and least favorites of the season were. So it's time we take a look at that now. Anyways, you all know the rules as always. These are all based off of my opinions and you may disagree with me on some of them. And if you do, you have every right to do so. Anyways, let's just get started with the worst list. Plankton gets the boot. After a heated argument between Plankton and Karen, she kicks him out of the chum bucket and he goes to stay with SpongeBob for a bit. Eventually regretting what he said to Karen, Plankton decides to try and win her over with the help of SpongeBob. He comes up with a plan to make Karen jealous by having SpongeBob disguise himself as a female robot to make it look like they're dating. I'm kind of a bit split on how Karen and Plankton are portrayed as a couple. I wasn't a big fan of episodes like Computer Overload, Single Celled Anniversary, or Karen 2.0. I found most of them pretty boring or in some cases kind of annoying. And this episode is really no exception. In fact, I really don't have much to say about this episode. I mean, I guess they do sneak in a couple of funny moments. I mean, the whole beginning with Plankton's analyzer was hilarious. And I did like that whole segment of SpongeBob trying to make Plankton a better man to win Karen over. But aside from those, it's just a generic bad episode. I mean, it could be worse, but it could have been better.
I have also analyzed your screensaver, Karen. It is most beautiful.
No one asked you. Are you happy now, Karen?
Mermaid Pants. In this episode, SpongeBob and Patrick are cosplaying as Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, but they really start to get on Squidward and Mr. Krabs' nerves. So they decide to play along and cosplay as their nemesises. But Squidward eventually starts to go too far into trying to kill SpongeBob and Patrick. When I asked for a comeback of the superheroes, this isn't really what I had in mind. I appreciate what they were trying to do here, but the episode itself is really repetitive. Remember the opening of the first Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode? Yeah, imagine that, but it's an entire episode. Now, it actually worked a lot better there because SpongeBob and Patrick weren't being as intrusive. But in this episode, they deal a large amount of property damage and harass everyone else around them. And it's not really all that entertaining. I mean, it's not really that good of a sign when I find myself siding with Squidward when he's about to fry SpongeBob and Patrick. Now, that's not to say it's a complete waste of time. I mean, the whole segment during the bank was actually pretty funny. And I do admire the staff's intentions of honoring the characters of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. Since Ernest Borgnine, the voice of Mermaid Man, passed away in 2012, long before the episode was released. It's like what Pixar did with Cars 3 with Paul Newman's character, Doc Hudson. And I really do admire it when people do stuff like that. But man, this episode could have done so much better. And it really breaks my heart to see this episode end up on my worst list.
Why are we fighting Captain Tightwad? He didn't even commit a crime.
What do you mean?
Oh, Mr. Krabs, it's right here in Mermaid Man number 98. No superhero shall fight a supervillain until that supervillain has committed a crime.
The Incredible Shrinking Sponge. In this episode, the grill is cranked up to beyond the maximum temperature, and the heat causes SpongeBob to shrink down in size. He has fun with being tiny and interacts with everything around him, but being tiny isn't all it's cracked up to be, as he can't cook Krabby Patties anymore, and the people around him are mutilating him. This is easily the most forgettable episode of Season 10. I kid you not, I could not remember a single thing about this episode. And even rewatching it, I had no clue about what happened during this episode. It's a simple concept which I'm fond of, but unlike most other attempts at this, The Incredible Shrinking Sponge has barely anything to say about it. It's just so boring. Oh, and they actually tossed in a few gross out moments, which is fun. And the resolution just makes no sense. Like, did this seriously not happen before? Overall, this episode is just really dumb. It's boring, repetitive, and forgettable.
You're not small like me, shorty. I am a towering half a millimeter taller than you. I win!
Snooze You Lose. Squidward is very tired and anxious as he has to audition for a clarinet recital tomorrow. He eventually falls into a deep sleep, and by the next morning, SpongeBob and Patrick have to wake him up so he doesn't miss the auditions. And after many failed attempts, they ultimately go inside of Squidward's body and play him like a puppet. Oh boy, another Vorn episode, my favorite!
You should see the look on your face.
I had a feeling he was going to do that. You owe me $5.
Seriously, what is it with these kinds of jokes? It's not funny! And the fact that most of this episode relies on this one joke is fucking idiotic! I said this in my season 4 video, and I'll say it again. I hate it when shows and movies do this kind of joke of a living being being inside of another living being. And this episode is no exception. Watching SpongeBob and Patrick try to run around Bikini Bottom inside Squidward's body was just... Ugh. This is another case of an episode that actually made me sick. And it's not even trying to hide the fact that it looks horrifying. And the worst part is that this takes up a large chunk of the episode. And even looking past that, the rest of the episode was boring to watch. Literally, the only thing that managed to get my attention in a positive way was J.K. Simmons' guest appearance. And even then, it feels completely wasted on this episode. Simply put, I did not have a good time with this. If you like this kind of humor, then that's fine. I mean, I understand humor is very subjective. But as someone who hates these kinds of jokes, it's safe to say that this episode just isn't worth my time. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go heave out my dinner while I bleach my eyeballs out.
Only we could just crawl up inside Squidward and play him like a puppet.
That's it! We could crawl up inside Squidward and play him like a puppet!
Ooh, whose dumb idea was that?
Yours.
Well, sounds good to me.
Housewarming. After losing his home to a predator, a worm named Prickles seeks refuge in SpongeBob. He's willing to let him stay, but little did he know that he would invite all his friends to live inside him. And as a result, everyone casts him aside since he's infectious. I literally take back what I said about Snooze You Lose. This episode managed to be just as grotesque and disturbing, except this time it managed to piss me off. Basically, every single character in this episode is either an idiot or an asshole. SpongeBob was a complete moron for easily letting the worm stay in his body, and then letting his friends come over and take over all of it. The episode tries to get across the idea that SpongeBob made a big mistake, but it goes way too far into making him feel miserable. Like he gets kicked out of his own freaking house by his own freaking pet! Yeah, best pet of the year, my ass! So it's basically the same problem as Little Yellow Book. Hell, I'd even take that episode any day of the week. At least it had a couple of funny moments. But here, most of the jokes just completely fell flat for me. Not even that whole flashback epilogue was all that funny to me. Sure, it may be the best part of the episode, because I was actively cheering on the clan for trying to kill this little prick. Yeah, you know what? Retract what I said earlier. When they expected me to feel bad for this prick, I actually bursted out laughing. Like, how do you expect me to sympathize with someone who tried to take over someone else's body? But it's not like you can make these kind of episodes unironically funny. An obvious comparison would be with Jellyfish Jam. The fact that that episode, from all the way back 18 years prior in season 1, was better than this, it's just a sign of how terrible this episode is. For all those reasons and more, Housewarming is easily my least favorite episode of season 10. And I hope that clam comes back to eat this little prick. And those were my least favorite episodes of season 10. Again, it was pretty slim pickings in some instances. but I think I may have had it a little bit easier with the best list. I still struggled a bit on putting what where, but after going back and forth between episodes, I think I'm a bit more confident with my top 5 list. So let's take a look at the episodes that managed to make the cut. Life insurance. After sustaining injuries, SpongeBob comes across a commercial for life insurance and he signs up for him and Patrick, thinking that they'll be safe from harm for as long as the contract is valid. To test this, they constantly try to hurt themselves with pillows, falling off a box, and trying to get stung by jellyfish. However, Squidward tells them that's not how life insurance works at all. But when they give him the contract, he miraculously survives all sorts of different accidents. Convinced that he was wrong about life insurance, he ends up pushing the limits with it. Okay, I probably like this episode a bit more than what I was expecting. Yes, it's another episode of Squidward torture, but I think this is a much better handled episode than those atrocities. For one, I think some of the torture did have some merits. I mean, the first two were meant to draw comparisons between how SpongeBob and Patrick were hurting themselves to Squidward accidentally hurting himself. And secondly, the episode was a lot funnier than what I was expecting. There were plenty of moments that left a smile on my face.
What you gonna do, Squidward?
What does it look like? I'm running into a wall!
Oh! Yes, that's just what it needed. I'll call the painting One Hole. 3 holes? That makes no sense!
Really, my biggest grievance with the episode is that even as a kid, I knew very well that wasn't how life insurance works, making some of the scenarios feel a little forced, despite how funny they were. And maybe there was a couple of Squidward torture moments that I really didn't like. But if you're willing to look past that, I'd say you might find some enjoyment watching this episode.
I said
Squidward, what were you yelling?
I was trying to say you gotta fall from something higher.
Plankton retires. After numerous failed attempts to steal the formula, Plankton has finally decided to throw in the towel and retire from working at the chum bucket. However, when word gets out, Krabs isn't fully convinced that Plankton is actually retiring, so he follows him around to see if he's hiding anything or if he's really done with competing. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this is probably the most divisive episode of Season 10. There are those who really like this episode, calling it one of the highlights of the season, and there are those who can't stand it, calling it one of the weaker episodes of the season. I find myself siding with the people who like this episode, but I can definitely see its flaws. One of the biggest being that whole reveal that Plankton was actually a robot. I'm pretty sure everyone saw this coming a mile away, and even if you didn't, it just feels like a cop-out. It's pretty much a typical attempt to steal the formula, and they try so hard to convince you otherwise. So why is this on my best list then? Well, simply put, its humor more than makes up for it. If the jokes didn't really land for me, I would have placed this episode a lot lower. But the jokes they tell throughout this episode is consistently funny. Except for that whole hiding inside a stomach thing. Seriously, would you please stop trying? But I have to say the highlight of this episode was definitely the ending reveal. Like, after the whole Plankton decoy reveal I knew was coming, I genuinely didn't expect SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs to do the exact same thing. That was actually pretty clever. We even get a little montage of them enjoying life. That was pretty cool. So yeah, it could have its flaws, but some of the positives do outweigh the negative ones, making for a decent and enjoyable Plankton-centered episode.
Wait, is this live?
Yes!
Don't broadcast my secret plans! They're secret! I will destroy all of you!
Furl friends. In this episode, Bikini Bottom is under the spell of Neptune's Moon, which turns the citizens into primitive fish. Sandy, being the only person not affected by the moon, tries to warn everyone, but they fall victim to the moon, including Squidward, who turns into a giant octopus and tries to chase down Sandy and her friends. It's up to her to keep her friends safe until the moon is down. I have to say this is probably the smartest episode the show has concocted in recent years. Turning the Bikini Bottomites into primitive fish is a really clever concept, and they managed to make the most out of it. The character designs are really well done. For the most part, it's believable that they would look like that in real life. I especially love the size changes with Squidward and Pearl. On top of that, they managed to supply some really funny jokes as well. My favorite is definitely the documentary parody, as we see the characters interact with their natural habitats and others around them. I'll admit, Patchy probably could have been cut out from this episode entirely and not much would change. In fact, I probably would have liked it better if his return was actually in SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout, since that episode actually gives us what we would want to see. More on that in the future video. But aside from that, this was a genuinely great episode. It's funny, engaging, and really smart. And I'd be down to see more episodes like this in the future.
Oh, no you don't! Oh! I knew I was gonna have to separate you two!
The Getaway. In this episode, as Mrs. Puff desperately calls for a new driving instructor, a convicted criminal hijacks her boat and SpongeBob mistakes him for his new driving instructor. This is where the criminal tries to teach him how to drive and escape from the police. Meanwhile, the actual getaway driver shows up late and Mrs. Puff realizes that SpongeBob is with a wanted criminal, so she gets the driver to chase down the two. Now we get to the really fun episodes. Between this and the number 1 pick, they are tied for the funniest episode of the season. Almost every single joke in this episode had me cackling. Not all of them land, but man, they just went all out with the humor here. From the new characters of Sticky Fins and Dorsal Dan, they provide plenty of funny one-liners and physical gags. And the voice acting really lends to these as well.
Oh! Great face! We're being followed! Lose that tail!
I thought it'd make me look cool.
Not the tail! The cop's behind us!
The action is also really engaging. You could tell the animators are having a really fun time making this episode. From the physical humor to the facial expressions. Even get a little reference to one of the writers of the show. That's pretty cool. Of course, it does have a couple of flaws. Like, I really didn't like the opening joke in the episode. It's probably the worst thing Mrs. Puff could have ever suggested. And of course, they had to make the cops idiots in this episode. But I'm still saving this discussion for another time. But otherwise, this is a fantastic episode. And one I could definitely find myself coming back to.
I say, how's my automobiling?
Simply smashing! You're simply smashing into things!
Krusty Catering. Krabs puts together a catering crew for a birthday party, but after all hell goes loose, they try to flee the scene. They bump into a fancy person, and she mistakes him for the caterers for her party. Krabs goes with it to earn a big check, and his crew follows along, mainly to get out of the other party. However, they're way out of their league to cater the fancy party, and they find themselves in all sorts of shenanigans. Yeah, this is still my favorite episode of the season. It's a really funny and enjoyable episode. Now, it does start off a little bit weak, particularly with some of the first few jokes during the kids' party.
Any ideas? How's that? Perfect!
But as the episode goes on, the humor just keeps getting funnier and funnier. There can be a few pauses here and there, but the episode manages to get more laughs out of me the further we go. My favorite running gag in the episode is with the little birthday kid. Not only does he supply the funniest joke,
Won't be seeing him again anytime soon.
I want my birthday cake!
Oh!
but he does actually have a sympathetic side.
Gosh, no one ever cared enough about me to explain that. It's like you're my real father. May I hug you?
Maybe some of the jokes were a bit on the nose, like with how much of a glutton Patrick is and how no one likes Squidward's clarinet playing, but it still does manage to get a smile out of me. And I did kind of like that enormous waterbed joke. I don't know why, but those kind of jokes always make me smirk. Plus, much like the Getaway, some of the humor is pretty fast-paced at times, particularly during the last act of the episode. And some of the facial expressions are just as good here as they were in that episode. It feels like a trend in the later seasons, and I would definitely take those over the hyper-realistic facial expressions. Like, good lord, those things were hideous. But overall, I really loved this episode. It may not be a masterpiece akin to some of the previous season's best episodes, but it's nonetheless my favorite episode of Season 10.
Don't hit nice old Mr. Krabs. It's the piñata you want, son. Big money! Do I look like a pinata to you, boy?
Yes! Get
So those were my favorite episodes of Season 10. That just leaves us with 2 more seasons to go before I'm all caught up. Also, I want to thank you all for helping me hit 2,000 subscribers. I've been working on a few non-SpongeBob related countdowns and reviews I want to do in the future, and I've been wanting to do one of them for this milestone, but due to a few personal events and other projects I've been working on, I didn't think I'd be able to meet a certain deadline for those videos. But I do want to confirm I'm still working on them. But I do have plans on a SpongeBob related video that isn't a countdown for a season, but rather a certain aspect in these episodes. I'm still working on it and I don't know when it will be out, but I'll try to finish it as quick as I can. Anyways, what are your favorites and least favorites of Season 10? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you all for watching, thanks for 2,000 subscribers, and I'll see you all for the Season 11 list.